Listen to me, he said now. You must stay away from them. Your face hides nothing. You would yield to me now were I to question you. Look into my eyes. I didn't do this. I fixed my eyes firmly on one of those small paintings above his desk until it ceased to be the Madonna and Child and became a harmony of line and color, because I knew what he was saying to me was true. Stop, if you will. Advise them that we don't mean any harm. Why can't you do this? You say yourself we're not your enemies, no matter what we've done. I could hear him sigh faintly. I have stopped them for the time being, he said, but I don't want such power over them as would be necessary to stop them entirely, because if I exercise such power, then I must protect it. I will make enemies, and I would have forever to deal with my enemies, when all I want here is a certain space, a certain peace. Or not to be here at all. I accept the scepter of sorts they've given me, but not to rule over them, only to keep them at a distance. I should have known, I said, my eyes still fixed on the painting. Then you must stay away. Celeste has a great deal of power, being one of the oldest, and she is jealous of the child's beauty. And Santiago, as you can see, is only waiting for a shred of proof that you're outlaws. I turned slowly and looked at him again, where he sat with the eerie vampire stillness, as if he were in fact not alive at all. The moment lengthened. I heard his words just as if he were speaking them again. All I want here is a certain space, a certain peace, or not to be here at all. And I felt a longing for him so strong that it took all my strength to contain it, merely to sit there gazing at him, fighting it. I wanted it to be this way. Claudia safe amongst these vampires somehow, guilty of no crime they might ever discover from her or anyone else, so that I might be free to remain forever in this cell as long as I could be welcome, even tolerated, allowed here on any condition whatsoever. I could see that mortal boy again as if he were not asleep on the bed, but kneeling at Armand's side with his arms around Armand's neck. It was an icon for me of love, the love I felt. Not physical love, you must understand. I don't speak of that at all. Though Armand was beautiful and simple, and no intimacy with him would ever have been repellent. For vampires, physical love culminates and is satisfied in one thing, the kill. I speak of another kind of love, which drew me to him completely as the teacher which Lestat had never been. Knowledge would never be withheld by Armand. I knew it. I would pass through him as through a pane of glass so that I might bask in it and absorb it and grow. I shut my eyes, and I thought I heard him speak, so faintly I wasn't certain. It seemed to say, "Do you know why I am here?" I looked up at him again, wondering if he knew my thoughts, could actually perceive them. If such could conceivably be the extent of that power. Now, after all these years, I could forgive Lestat for being nothing but an ordinary creature who could not show me the uses of my powers, and yet I still longed for this, could fall into it without resistance. A sadness pervaded it all, sadness for my own weakness and my own awful dilemma. Claudia waited for me, Claudia who was my daughter and my love. "What am I to do?" I whispered. "Go away from them? Go away from you? After all these years?" "They don't matter to you," he said. I smiled and nodded. "What is it you want to do?" he asked, and the voice assumed the most gentle, sympathetic tone. "Don't you know? Don't you have that power?" I asked. "Can't you read my thoughts as if they were words?" He shook his head. "Not the way you mean. I only know the danger to you and the child is real because it's real to you. And I know your loneliness, even with her love, is almost more terrible than you can bear. I stood up then. It would seem a simple thing to do. To rise, to go to the door, to hurry quickly down that passage, and yet it took every ounce of strength, every smattering of that curious thing I've called my detachment. "I ask you to keep them away from us," I said at the door, but I couldn't look back at him, didn't even want the soft intrusion of his voice. "Don't go," he said. "I have no choice." I was in the passage when I heard him so close to me that I started. He stood beside me, eye level with my eye, and in his hand he held a key, which he pressed into mine. "There is a door there," he said, gesturing to the dark end which I'd thought to be merely a wall, "and a stairs to the side street which no one uses but myself. Go this way now, so you can avoid the others. You are anxious, and they will see it." I turned around to go at once, though every part of my being wanted to remain there. "But let me tell you this," he said, and lightly pressed the back of his hand against my heart. "Use the power inside you. Don't abhor it any more. Use that power. And when they see you in the streets above, use that power to make your face a mask, and think as you gaze on them as on anyone. Beware. Take that word as if it were an amulet I'd given you to wear about your neck, and when your eyes meet Santiago's eyes, or the eyes of any other vampire, speak to them politely what you will, but think of that word and that word only. Remember what I say. I speak to you simply because you respect what is simple. You understand this. That's your strength." I took the key from him, and I don't remember actually putting it into the lock or going up the steps, or where he was or what he'd done, except that, as I was stepping into the dark side street behind the theatre, I heard him say very softly to me from some place close to me, "Come here, to me, when you can." I looked around for him, but was not surprised that I couldn't see him. He had told me also some time or other that I must not leave the Hotel St. Gabriel, that I must not give the others the shred of evidence of guilt they wanted. "You see," he said, "killing other vampires is very exciting. That is why it is forbidden under penalty of death." And then I seemed to awake, to the Paris street shining with rain, to the tall, narrow buildings on either side of me, to the fact that the door had shut to make a solid dark wall behind me, and that Armand was no longer there. And though I knew Claudia waited for me, though I passed her in the hotel window above the gas lamps, a tiny figure standing among waxen-petalled flowers, I moved away from the boulevard, letting the darker streets swallow me as so often the streets of New Orleans had done. It was not that I did not love her. Rather, it was that I loved her only too well, and the passion for her was as great as the passion for Armand, and I fled them both now, letting the desire for the kill rise in me like a welcome fever, threatening consciousness, threatening pain. Out of the mist which had followed the rain, a man was walking towards me. I can remember him as roaming on the landscape of a dream, because the night around me was dark and unreal. The hill might have been anywhere in the world, and the soft lights of Paris were an amorphous shimmering in the fog. And sharp-eyed and drunk, he was walking blindly into the arms of death itself, his pulsing fingers reaching out to touch the very bones of my face. I was not crazed yet, not desperate. I might have said to him, "Pass by." I believe my lips did form the word Armand had given me. Beware. Yet I let him slip his bold, drunken arm around my waist. I yielded to his adoring eyes, to the voice that begged to paint me now and spoke of warmth, to the rich, sweet smell of the oils that streaked his loose shirt. I was following him through Montmartre, and I whispered to him, "You are not a member of the dead." He was leading me through an overgrown garden, through the sweet, wet grasses, and he was laughing as I said, "Alive, alive." His hand touching my cheek, stroking my face, clasping finally my chin as he guided me into the light of the low doorway, his reddened face brilliantly illuminated by the oil lamps, the warmth seeping about us as the door closed. I saw the great sparkling orbs of his eyes, the tiny red veins that reached for the dark centers, that warm hand burning my cold hunger as he guided me to a chair, and then all around me I saw faces blazing, faces rising in the smoke of the lamps, in the shimmer of the burning stove, a wonderland of colors on canvases surrounding us beneath the small sloped roof, a blaze of beauty that pulsed and throbbed. Sit down," he said to me, those feverish hands against my chest, clasped by my hands, yet sliding away, my hunger rising in waves. And now I saw him at a distance, eyes intent, the palette in his hand, the huge canvas obscuring the arm that moved, and mindless and helpless I sat there drifting with his paintings, drifting with those adoring eyes, letting it go on till Armand's eyes were gone, and Claudia was running down that stone passage with clicking heels away from me. Away from me. "You are alive," I whispered. "Bones," he answered me. "Bones." And then I saw them in heaps, taken from those shallow graves in New Orleans, taken from those shallow graves in New Orleans as they are, and put in chambers behind the sepulchre so that another can be laid in that narrow plot. I felt my eyes close. I felt my hunger become agony, my heart crying out for a living heart, and then I felt him moving forward, hands out to right my face. That fatal step, that fatal lurch, a sigh escaped my lips. "Save yourself," I whispered to him. "Beware." And then something happened in the moist radiance of his skin. Something drained the broken vessels of his fragile skin. He backed away from me, the brush falling from his hands, and I rose over him, feeling my teeth against my lip, feeling my eyes fill with the colors of his face, my ears fill with his struggling cry, my hands fill with that strong fighting flesh, until I drew him up to me, helpless, and tore that flesh and had the blood that gave it life. "Die," I whispered when I held him loose now, his head bowed against my coat. "Die," and felt him struggle to look up at me. And again I drank, and again he fought, until at last he slipped limp and shocked and near to death on the floor. Yet his eyes did not close. I settled before his canvas, weak, at peace, gazing down at him, at his vague, graying eyes, my own hands florid, my skin so luxuriously warm. "I am mortal again," I whispered to him. "I am alive. With your blood, I am alive." His eyes closed. I sank back against the wall and found myself gazing at my own face. A sketch was all he'd done, a series of bold black lines that nevertheless made up my face and shoulders perfectly. And the color was already begun in dabs and splashes, the green of my eyes, the white of my cheek. But the horror of seeing my expression, for he had captured it perfectly, and there was nothing of horror in it. Those green eyes gazed at me from out of that loosely drawn shape with a mindless innocence, the expressionless wonder of that overpowering craving which he had not understood. Louis of 100 years ago, lost in listening to the sermon of a priest at Mass, lips parted and slack, hair careless, a hand curved in the lap and limp. A mortal Louis. I believe I was laughing, putting my hands to my face and laughing so that the tears nearly rose in my eyes. And when I took my fingers down, there was the stain of the tears, tinged with mortal blood. And already there was begun in me the tingling of the monster that had killed and would kill again, who was gathering up the painting now and starting to flee with it from the small house. When suddenly up from the floor, the man rose with an animal groan and clutched at my boot, his hands sliding off the leather. With some colossal spirit that defied me, he reached up for the painting and held fast to me with his whitening hands. "Give it back," he growled at me. "Give it back." And we held fast, the two of us. I stared at him and at my own hands that held so easily that we sought so desperately to rescue. As if he would take it to heaven or hell. I, the thing that his blood could not make human. He, the man that my evil had not overcome. And then, as if I were not myself, I tore the painting loose from him, and, wrenching him up to my lips with one arm, gashed his throat in rage. Entering the rooms of the Hotel St. Gabriel, I set the picture on the mantel above the fire and looked at it a long time. Claudia was somewhere in the rooms, and some other presence intruded, as though on one of the balconies above a woman or a man stood near, giving off an unmistakable personal perfume. I didn't know why I had taken the picture, why I'd fought for it so that it shamed me now worse than the death, and why I still held on to it at the marble mantel, my head bowed, my hands visibly trembling. And then slowly I turned my head. I wanted the rooms to take shape around me. I wanted the flowers, the velvet, the candles in their sconces to be mortal and trivial and safe. And then, as if in a mist, I saw a woman there. She was seated calmly at that lavish table, where Claudia attended to her hair, and so still she sat, so utterly without fear, her green taffeta sleeves reflected in the tilted mirrors, her skirts reflected, that she was not one still woman, but a gathering of women. Her dark red hair was parted in the middle and drawn back to her ears, though a dozen little ringlets escaped to make a frame for her pale face. And she was looking at me with two calm, violet eyes, and a child's mouth that seemed almost obdurately I'm not sure what this word is. Obdurately? Perhaps. Obdurately soft. Obdurately the Cupid's bow unsullied by paint or personality. Sorry, I don't know what that means. And the mouth smiled now and said, as those eyes seemed to fire, "Yes, he's as you said he would be. And I love him already. He's as you said." She rose now, gently lifting that abundance of dark taffeta, and the three small mirrors emptied at once. And utterly baffled and almost incapable of speech, I turned to see Claudia far off on the immense bed, her small face rigidly calm, though she clung to the silk curtain with a tight fist. "Madeline," she said under her breath, "Louis is shy." And she watched with cold eyes as Madeline only smiled when she said this, and, drawing closer to me, put both of her hands to the lace fringe around her throat, moving it back so I could see the two small marks there. Then the smile died on her lips, and they became at once sullen and sensual as her eyes narrowed and she breathed the word, "Drink." I turned away from her, my fist rising in a consternation for which I couldn't find words. But then Claudia had hold of that fist, and was looking up at me with relentless eyes. "Do it, Louis," she commanded, "because I cannot do it." Her voice was painfully calm, and the emotion under the hard, measured tone. I'll start that again. "Do it, Louis," she commanded, "because I cannot do it." Her voice was painfully calm, all the emotion under the hard, measured tone. I haven't the size. I haven't the strength. You saw to that when you made me. Do it." I broke away from her, clutching my wrist as if she'd burned it. I could see the door, and it seemed to me the better part of wisdom to leave by it at once. I could feel Claudia's strength, her will, and the mortal woman's eyes seemed afire with that same will. But Claudia held me, not with a gentle pleading, a miserable coaxing that would have dissipated that power, making me feel pity for her as I gathered my forces. She held me with the emotion her eyes had evinced even through her coldness, and the way that she turned away from me now, almost as if she'd been instantly defeated. I did not understand the manner in which she sank back on the bed, her head bowed, her lips moving feverishly, her eyes rising only to scan the walls. I wanted to touch her, and say to her that what she asked was impossible. I wanted to soothe the fire that seemed to be consuming her from within. And the soft, mortal woman had settled into one of the velvet chairs by the fire, with the rustling and iridescence of her taffeted dress surrounding her like part of the mystery of her dispassionate eyes which watched us now, the fever of her pale face. I remember turning to her, spurred on by that childish pouting mouth set against the fragile face. The vampire kiss had left no visible trace except the wound, no inalterable change on the pale pink flesh. "How do we appear to you?" I asked, seeing her eyes on Claudia. She seemed excited by the diminutive beauty, the awful woman's passion knotted in the small, dimpled hands. She broke her gaze and looked up at me. "I ask you, how do we appear? Do you think us beautiful, magical, our white skin, our fierce eyes? Oh, I remember perfectly what mortal vision was, the dimness of it, and how the vampire's beauty burned through that veil, so powerfully alluring, so utterly deceiving. Drink, you tell me. You haven't the vaguest conception under God of what you ask." But Claudia rose from the bed and came towards me. "How dare you?" she whispered. "How dare you make this decision for both of us? Do you know how I despise you? Do you know that I despise you with the passion that eats at me like a canker?" Her small form trembled, her hands hovering over the pleated bodice of her yellow gown. "Don't you look away from me. I am sick at heart with your looking away, with your suffering. You understand nothing. Your evil is that you cannot be evil, and I must suffer for it. I tell you, I will suffer no longer." Her fingers bit into the flesh of my wrist. I twisted, stepping back from her, floundering in the face of the hatred, the rage rising like some dormant beast in her, looking out through her eyes. "Snatching me from mortal hands like two grim monsters in a nightmare fairy tale. You idle, blind parents! Fathers!" She spat the word. "Let tears gather in your eyes. You haven't tears enough for what you've done to me. 6 more mortal years. 7, 8, I might have been that shape." Her pointed finger flew at Madeline, whose hands had risen to her face, whose eyes were clouded over. Her moan was almost Claudia's name, but Claudia did not hear her. "Yes, that shape. I might have known what it was like to walk at your side. Monsters! To give me immortality in this hopeless guise, this helpless form." The tears stood in her eyes. The words had died away, drawn in, as it were, on her breast. "Now, you give her to me," she said, her head bowing, her curls tumbling down to make a concealing veil. "You give her to me. You do this, or you finish what you did to me that night in the hotel in New Orleans. I will not live with this hatred any longer. I will not live with this rage. I cannot. I will not abide it. And tossing her hair, she put her hands to her ears as if to stop the sound of her own words, her breath drawn in rapid gasps, the tears seeming to scald her cheeks. I had sunk to my knees at her side, and my arms were outstretched as if to enfold her. Yet I dared not touch her, dared not even say her name, lest my own pain break from me with the first syllable in a monstrous outpouring of hopelessly inarticulate cries. Oh, she shook her head now, squeezing the tears out onto her cheeks, her teeth clenched tight together. I love you still. That's the torment of it. Lestat, I never loved you, but you. The measure of my hatred is that love. They are the same. Do you know how much I hate you? She flashed at me through the red film that covered her eyes. Yes, I whispered. I bowed my head, but she was gone from me into the arms of Madeline, who enfolded her desperately, as if she might protect Claudia from me. The irony of it, the pathetic irony. Protect Claudia from herself. She was whispering to Claudia, "Don't cry, don't cry," her hands stroking Claudia's face and hair with a fierceness that would have bruised a human child. But Claudia seemed lost again, her breast suddenly... But Claudia seemed lost against her breast suddenly. Her eyes closed, her face smooth as if all passion were drained away from her, her arms sliding up around Madeline's neck, her head falling against the taffeta and lace. She lay still, the tears staining her cheeks, as if this that had risen to the surface had left her weak and desperate for oblivion, as if the room around her, as if I were not there. And there they were together, a tender mortal crying unstintingly now, her warm arms holding what she could not possibly understand, this white and fierce and unnatural child thing she believed she loved. And if I had not felt for her, this mad and reckless woman flirting with the damned, if I had not felt all the sorrow for her I felt for my mortal self, I would have wrested the demon thing from her arms, held it tight to me, denying over and over the words I'd just heard. But I knelt there still, thinking only, the love is equal to the hatred, gathering that selfishly to my own breast, holding on to that as I sank back against the bed. And that's where we'll leave it for today. Alright, so that is another little section of Interview with the Vampire. What is some of the cool stuff that happened today? First thing I have noted down here relates to Armand's fascination with Louis, and I think what we get kind of affirmed here in this little section is the notion of Armand wanting to take Louis away from Claudia and sort of go off into the world with him because of his fascination with Louis and his fascination with the way Louis views the world, and essentially use Louis as a avenue through which he can kind of find his own meaning. And of course Louis agrees with Armand in this regard, and Louis wants to find a way to bring it about, because Louis becomes very quickly obsessed with Armand. And the main avenue for this obsession, I think, that Louis hints towards is the fact that Armand would not withhold knowledge from him. Louis believes, and in some ways regresses, that to his earlier state of really wanting to find out the philosophical details of the vampiric condition. Which is ironic because he very, very nearly transcended it last section, and we'll see about that in a second. But I say obsession because I really need to hammer this home, is that there is no love in this text. There is no love between any of these characters. There is only a fleeting obsession that changes and begins and changes just as easily as it begins. And, Louis has been hopelessly, quote, in love with 3 different characters over the course of this story, and all of them have been essentially using that obsession to bring about his abuse and manipulation. It's never actual love. It's never properly reciprocal. It's never caring. It's always abusive. And so it's obsession. It isn't love, in my view. And ironically enough, when Louis buys into Armand, and Louis goes along with Armand's notion, essentially, he doesn't fully agree with him yet. He says he has to go, but it's clear that he is planning to meet up with Armand again in the future. Once he kind of accepts this obsession with Armand, founded on Armand's fascination with his moral kind of epiphany about the vampiric condition, he loses that epiphany. Because Louis buys into Armand and accepts Armand's view of the world ever so slightly, he ends up rejecting the very thing that made him fascinating to Armand, which is ironic and fitting, because when he's leaving, Armand convinces Louis to use rather than reject his monstrosity, which is something that runs directly counter to what Louis just kind of touched on with the notion of vampires and humans being basically the same thing, and the fact that if nothing means anything, then that means it's even more important to care about people. Maybe I'm putting too much weight on Louis' small revelation there. Maybe he didn't actually believe it. Maybe I've read it wrong. But it feels like he has just accidentally gone against the very thing that made him fascinating, which is fitting. And we see this kind of manifest itself in regards to the artist. And I've got a few notes on the artist here, because the artist that Louis encounters on his way home to the hotel introduces this very classic Gothic trope of the portrait and the portrait painter and the portrait showing something about characters in its reveal. And in the portrait, Louis is horrified by the lack of horror in it. He sees an untainted vision of himself, and he is forced to reflect on the fact that on the exterior, he looks no different than he did the day he died. His outward appearance has not changed to match his growing inner monstrosity. The fact that he has killed thousands of people, the fact that he has acted in reprehensible ways time and time again, has had no reflection on his outer appearance, and he still appears beautiful and calm to the outside world. And there's obviously parallels to the picture of Dorian Gray, pretty clear parallels to the picture of Dorian Gray. And there's a lot of picture of Dorian Gray stuff going on in this text as a whole, except here, in this portrait, the taint is kind of manifested through the fact that the portrait is untainted. Because the portrait looks so perfect, and because Louis looks so perfect, it indicates to us that there's no greater meaning behind the world. There's no greater moral system keeping track of people and forcing them to reckon with their actions. The only taint that is forcing people to reckon with their actions comes from within. And so Louis is horrified by the fact that his outer appearance does not match what he perceives as his inner ugliness. And I would agree that he has a lot of inner ugliness going on here, because he has performed many evil actions and continues to do so unrepentantly. I really want to point out here that Louis does not have to kill the artist, but he talks like he does. Louis kills the artist of his own volition. He does so because he is following Armand's guidelines, essentially. He does this whole thing where he's like, beware, trying to quote unquote warn the artist, but he chooses it. He chooses to kill this artist. And in killing the artist, he firmly and solidly rejects that epiphany that he came to very recently regarding the value of humanity. He rejects that notion and reverts to the vampiric line of thinking in which the vampire is superior to other beings, and rightfully can kill as it desires. He was so close to escaping the cycle of monstrosity and abuse, but he just fell at the last hurdle because of this growing obsession with Armand and his desire to find out more about his vampiric condition, when in reality he already knew everything he needed to know, which was that he was not forced by his vampiric condition to do anything. Every evil action that Louis does in this text is his own choice, fundamentally, at the end of the day. He can blame outside forces for influencing him wrongly, but he has still acted in immoral manners, and he has still behaved in evil ways. And this is another rung down on Louis' death spiral. There was a brief little spike where we thought, oh, maybe he'll escape the death spiral. But no, he just seems to keep going. He just seems to keep going, and he's going faster and faster away from his own humanity. He's rejecting it more and more every day. And we'll see how that goes. We'll see if he can escape it before it's too late. Another thing I have here noted down relates to Claudia. And I think what we see here in this section is that Claudia finally drops her facade. She realizes she's been beat by Armand, that she is very likely to go the way of Lestat if she doesn't do anything. Not that she thinks he'll kill her, but probably someone else will kill her. Because if she doesn't have Louis to protect her, she's kind of out of luck. And she can't make her own vampire companion because she's too small. She could only make a child. That's not going to be massively useful. So she drops her facade of pretending to love Louis completely. She has essentially a breakdown. And upon seeing Louis and seeing Louis deny her this vampiric companion in Madeleine, she just lets him know how much she hates him. She lets loose those decades upon decades of pent-up anger. All those decades of pretending she loved Louis in order to, ensure his protection. She throws that out the window and in no uncertain terms tells Louis, I hate you. I hate you for what you have done to me. And rightfully so. She has every right to hate him for what he has done to her. But I think the true tragedy here is that her hatred is founded in the fact that Louis and Lestat did not maximize her condition. Her hatred is not founded in Louis and Lestat making her a vampire in the first place, taking away her life. It is instead founded in the fact that Louis and Lestat did not make her a vampire at the optimal time. And this is tragic, but it is understandable because Claudia doesn't understand life outside of vampirism. So she is only really able to hate them for denying her a better form of vampirism. She isn't, we can't, again, as I say again, we can't hold Claudia to the same moral standards as the other vampires because she was not given an opportunity to develop those moral standards that they were given plenty of chance to develop. And so Claudia hates Louis. She rightfully hates Louis. She hates Louis for probably the wrong reasons, but it is very clear here that Claudia does hate Louis. And I think it lends an awful lot of strength to my reading of Claudia's relationship with Louis, in which she is essentially just manipulating him in order to survive. And the only spanner that gets thrown into the works regarding my reading here is when Claudia kind of goes back a little bit towards the end of her tirade and remarks that the hate she feels is equal to the love she feels. And this doesn't bother me too much, because this notion of the hate is equal to the love, I love you just as much as I hate you, is nonsense abuser language. It is fucking ridiculous, and it's not something people can actually do, I don't think. If you claim to love someone and hate someone in equal measure, you don't actually love them at all. You are engaged in some kind of harmful abuser dynamic, or you are intentionally trying to belittle them and abuse them in regards to creating this notion of inferiority within them. It's nonsense. It's not true. And I think its main intention here is to placate Louis slightly, and it does do so. Louis kind of, in his typical Stockholm syndromed manner, kind of, banks on it, and he tries to convince himself that she hates him just as much as she loves him, and she sure hates him a lot. And so he's trying to comfort himself with that. But even Louis, even good old Stockholm syndrome Louis, who is usually completely incapable of escaping these cycles of abuse, he's even seeing that this probably isn't actually the case, and that he is really, really detestable as a creature. So yeah, the final thing to talk about here, but it's mainly something for the next little section, is that Claudia has Madeline in the room, obviously, and she desires her as a vampiric companion, and we can only assume that the main role of Madeline will be to protect Claudia and replace Louis, essentially, because Claudia sees the writing on the wall that Louis is very soon going to be taken away from her by Armand. So we'll see how that develops, because there's some really interesting stuff to talk about in regards to Madeline and Claudia. But anyway, that is another little section of Interview with the Vampire. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again tomorrow for some more. See you then.